The Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus. This has been my daily driver for the last 2 weeks, and this will be my in-depth review. You know, on paper, this phone pretty much has all the features people seem to want in a phone nowadays. It's got a fantastic screen, phenomenal hardware, great battery life. It's pretty darn fast for now, at least. Some really neat software features, water resistance. It's got basically no bezels, no camera bump. It's got an SD card slot. The list goes on. It's definitely getting close to the perfect phone for a lot of people. You know, Samsung's done a ton of things right here, but for me personally, it's not exactly what I'm looking for. I'm not at all saying that this phone isn't one of the best to come out this year, and for most people, this is an incredible phone. But as I used it, I couldn't wait to go back to something like the V20, the 3T, or even the Pixel. It's not because Samsung did anything wrong. It's just because I don't like a couple features here, like the curved display. I'm not nuts about their software, although it's definitely the best version of a Samsung skin yet. If you like the curved display, and if you won't mind some iPhone aesthetic mixed in with your Android, this is absolutely one of the best phones to come out this year. The display, let's get this one out of the way early on. Samsung AMOLED displays are always incredible. The S8 Plus is no different. However, I hate the curved display. I hate it. I see no need for it and serves no practical benefit in my opinion. You know, it slightly distorts the edges of images. It makes gripping the phone during use kind of awkward. It's got a ton of glare. You can see just with my basic lighting here, all the glare the edges are picking up. Yeah, you've got an Edge app swipe over feature, you know, that I'll talk about in a bit, but I just don't get it. From a purely aesthetic perspective, it's beautiful. This phone is just gorgeous. The display is incredible. But once I started using it, I kept wishing it was just flat. It doesn't do much for me. I don't really get why it's here. It's pretty, but in my opinion, it's not that functional. The screen itself is fantastic, though. I have no qualms with the actual quality of the screen. On auto brightness, this is the brightest screen I've ever seen. It's a 2K display. However, you can actually go into settings and change the screen resolution here under display options. You're going between 1440p, 1080p, and 720p, which is a really nice feature to conserve battery life. Samsung also gives you a screen mode option here where you can kind of alternate between different screen and display settings. Adaptive display allegedly optimizes the color range, saturation, and sharpness of the display depending on what you're doing. From there, you can even manually adjust the RGB settings right here under advanced options, as well as the screen edge color balance to adjust the white tones. Samsung has also included a built-in blue light filter, which is phenomenal. I'm really glad that this is becoming the standard on pretty much all Android phones now, and my favorite part of this is that it's really customizable. You can turn it on indefinitely, or you can have it set to a custom schedule, or use a sunset to sunrise. I love sunset to sunrise just because then I don't even think about it. So you may have noticed that this phone is really tall. It's a really tall phone. Just to give you guys some perspective, here's the LG V20, and this is pretty much the biggest phone I've ever used, and the screen itself is pretty much as tall as the actual phone. And here's the iPhone for reference. It's 6.2 inches diagonal with a weird aspect ratio. This means that a full screen YouTube video, which is typically 16:9, will leave some black bars on either side. Honestly, I didn't really notice when they did this, and Samsung has added a setting to allow you to crop to fit videos like this, but it's not magically converting the aspect ratio to fit. It literally just crops the video to take up the whole screen, so sometimes it doesn't really work. I'll show you guys an example of what I'm talking about. Let's just put this video here in full screen. Got Tim Schofield going. Right now you can see some black bars on the edges, but YouTube has an option here to crop to fit. That'll take up the entire screen. It's cropping the video. It's slightly reducing quality, but you can't really tell, and it looks gorgeous when you have this thing in full screen. Just to show you what I'm talking about. Some apps will have trouble running natively in this aspect ratio, but if you click the Recent Apps button, you can actually have it automatically expand to take up the entire screen. This little guy right here, if I click that, now the black bars are gone. Just to give you an example, here's what it looked like before with the black bars and without. You can do this for just about every app, and for me it's worked fine, but I've heard that there are some apps that just have issues running natively, so if you need to, you do have the option to toggle back and forth between this. I do really like that Samsung doesn't force anyone to use this aspect ratio and at least gives them the opportunity to toggle back and forth between them. Now I want to talk about the size and feel of this phone. It's one of my favorite parts. This thing feels premium. It looks gorgeous. I mean, just look at this phone. I haven't really seen another phone quite like this in a long time. It's probably the best looking phone I've ever seen. The glass is not super slippery. It actually provides decent grip. It's a little, not sticky, but especially if your palms are sweaty a little bit, you're not going to worry about this slipping out of your hands like you would an aluminum back like the iPhone. It's got no camera bump. It's really impressive. Samsung has never really disappointed when it comes to hardware, and the S8 is no different. They even managed to squeeze a headphone jack in there. The phone is basically the exact same height as the iPhone 6s Plus. It's a couple millimeters thinner as well, but the iPhone has big bezels, which makes, gripping and utilizing it for me a little bit easier. Sometimes I think that this phone is just too tall, One-handed use can be frustrating because you have to reach so much further than you do for practically any other phone. But it's no more frustrating than something like the V20 here, which is just a really, really wide phone and basically impossible to reach the other side of the screen with one hand. It really just takes some getting used to, and once you get used to it, it's not an issue really at all. One of the issues I do have with this phone is that this thing, because it's so premium, it's all glass, it's fragile. It feels really fragile. I feel like I have to baby it wherever I go. It's a decent weight, it's all glass with the curved display. If I drop this thing, it's game over. I'm super nervous about using this phone without a case, and another issue is that if you have a case, it really detracts from how good looking this curved display is, which is a major selling point of the phone. One tiny other nitpicking thing for me, there's a discernible ridge right here where the screen actually meets the body of the phone. It's not sharp, but I do feel it every time you pick it up, so it's not a perfectly smooth transition. It's not a huge deal, it's nitpicky, but just something I figured you guys should know about. Samsung does provide an SD card slot here at the top of the phone. Thank you, Samsung, for doing this. This should be a standard, in my opinion. Although this one is kind of a pain in the ass to get in. You actually have to squeeze it in between the brackets here rather than just rest it on top of the tray, but at least they have one, and I'm really thankful for that. The power button is over here on the right side, and on the left side you've got the volume rocker and then the famous Bixby button. I just wish that these weren't so close to each other because I accidentally hit this Bixby button all the time. It's a little frustrating. I'll talk more about Bixby later, but I wish there's some way they could have made it maybe a different texture, kind of like how HTC does, or at least a little further down here, because I accidentally press this at least 5 times a day. But the buttons do feel nice and clicky, very premium, very good quality. Okay, the fingerprint scanner. This is the worst fingerprint scanner I have personally used on a phone. I know Samsung is trying to promote the iris scanner and facial recognition features, but for me, they're not quite prime time, so I still like to default to the fingerprint scanner. Plus, the fingerprint scanner is a lot more secure right now. This one is on the right side of the camera, level with the camera, and it's garbage. It's a horrible location. It has the exact same feel as the boundary of the camera glass right here, so it's really hard to tell the difference. The camera and the fingerprint scanner feel exactly the same, except the camera glass is a little bit bigger. I find myself accidentally touching the camera glass all the time, getting it super greasy. Samsung even has a notification that pops up every couple of days that reminds you to clean the camera glass because they know you're going to do this. Speed-wise, it's not horrible. I can give you guys an example here. That didn't register. That worked. Didn't work. That worked. That worked. So it's actually very quick. The problem is I can't find this very easily. Even after using this for about 2 weeks, I still have an issue locating the fingerprint scanner. Aside from the location, my main issue with the fingerprint scanner is when you're putting your fingerprint into the system, it requires that your finger cover up the entire rectangle here, and because it's a weird vertical rectangle, you pretty much have to do it like that, because if you do it like this, it's barely going to take up the entire space and it'll give you an error. So when you're laying your finger down on the phone to unlock it, you have to lay it down pretty much even like that, and because it's not dead center, I end up hitting like right here or getting half my finger on, and it just has a ton of issues registering. It's really just a problematic location. Another issue I've got here is that the phone will vibrate if the fingerprint is not registered, so if it doesn't go through, and it'll let you know, hey, you gotta try it again. But it does not vibrate if it successfully goes through. So when I'm just feeling around here blindly, it just turns the phone on. It doesn't vibrate at all like pretty much every other phone does, and there's no setting to adjust that. So here's what happens. I go to unlock it. It doesn't do anything because I don't know where my finger is touching. I turn the phone over so I can make sure my finger is actually on the scanner. Most phones at this point would vibrate once the finger is scanned and the phone is unlocked, but not this one. I've got to flip it back around, and I've got to make sure that it actually worked. You know, this is kind of a big deal. I know it might sound nitpicky, but most people use fingerprints to unlock their phones nowadays. I know Samsung is trying to get people to use the facial recognition, the iris scanners. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's still no excuse for this awful fingerprint scanner location. The least they could have done is change up the texture so it's very clear that that's the scanner and that that's the camera glass without looking at it. I know I say in every one of my reviews that I'm not a camera guy. This is basically just going to be a super simple does it suck or not camera review, and it does not suck. The Google Pixel might have the better actual camera, but this one is a lot more feature rich. You can kind of see here all the options that we've got. Video stabilization, grid lines. You have voice control, so you can actually say cheese, they'll take a picture. Most phones have that nowadays, but it's always neat. It actually has some pretty cool and useful filters right here. And then it's got stickers, which I don't really care about. And then it's copy and Snapchat with these little faces that you can add on top of the pictures that you take. That's all well and good. I know the kids love that kind of stuff nowadays. One of my favorite features here is this selective focus. This is specifically to focus on objects that are less than 20 inches away. I mean, look at this. Look at that. It's beautiful. I've always had an issue, even with the Google Pixel, taking pictures of objects that were really, really close to the phone with selective focus. That feature makes it super easy to take a picture of something that's very, very small or very, very close. You can actually go into Pro mode here, and this reminds me a lot of the LG V20. You can change the ISO. You have some more filters here. You can manually focus with focus peaking. There's the focus peaking, so it'll turn a light green as it brings the item into focus. You've got white balance here as well. Just a nice feature set here in the Pro mode. But the best thing for me with this camera is that you don't need to mess around with all these features. Everything out of the box works very, very well. This is one of the best cameras I've ever used. It might be my favorite camera on the market right now. I don't do video on the phone, unfortunately, so you'll need to check another review if you want some more info on that. After all the shit Samsung got last year for their awful speaker on the S7, they've really improved things here on the S8, and I was really impressed for a phone that has water resistance, how good this actually sounds. I would put it very close to the LG 20. It's a little tinier than the LG V20. It's about the same as the Pixel, I think. Nowhere near the quality HTC 10 or the Axon 7, but not much else is right now. But to get close to the Pixel with water resistance is very impressive. So this is actually a darn good speaker, and it gets nice and loud. Here's a quick sample of the speaker quality for the S8 Plus, the iPhone 6s Plus, and the LG V20. Now the iPhone. And the V20. Between all the phones, I think the iPhone has the best overall quality. The S8 probably gets the loudest, but if I had to choose one, I would go with the iPhone. This is the 6S version, by the way, not the 7, which even has better speakers than this. So it's a pretty average speaker, nothing special, but it's definitely better than something like last year's S7. And let's talk about the headphone audio quality. Like the Pixel XL, I was really impressed with the audio quality coming out of the headphone jack here. You know, I was doing some A/B testing with the iPhone and the OnePlus. It's very, very good. I would say it's very similar to the iPhone. It's definitely better than the OnePlus built-in amp and DAC. Unfortunately, the only pair of headphones I have to test here are really low impedance, meaning they don't need a whole lot of power to drive them properly. So sometimes it can be tough to differentiate audio quality once you get up to a certain level of quality on these phones, like the HTC 10 or the LG V20. Compared to the iPhone, the sound is slightly veiled, the mids are a little recessed, you know, the bass isn't quite as present or as full, but it's pretty darn close, and you won't notice a difference unless you have both phones side by side, and you're going back and forth with some decent headphones. Also for my testing, I've got a really nice pair of IEMs. These things have like 12 drivers, so if you're a casual listener or haven't invested in a mid-range pair of headphones, you likely won't notice a difference. If you paid $100 or less for your headphones, the S8 audio quality is going to be really impressive, and it's going to absolutely be good enough for you. The headphone jack's on the bottom left where it belongs. Samsung has also included some nifty software options here under sound and vibration, and then you scroll down to sound quality and effects. You've got a custom EQ You have this thing right here called the UHQ Upscaler, which to my ears is just a V-shaped EQ, really bass heavy, a bit more treble. It lowers down the mid so it sounds kind of cleaner. Surround sound right here tries to mimic a surround sound setup, but I'm not really a fan. One I actually do like is this Tube Amp Pro feature. It pumps the bass up, but it does it in a way that actually adds some nice texture to the sound. I myself have never owned a Tube Amp, but this absolutely makes me want to give one a shot. When I was using my Bluetooth headphones, I actually really liked having this setting on, and I think a lot of people are really going to like this Tube Amp Pro. If you just want a little bit more bass, you want to kind of liven up the sound, add a little bit of richness and texture, this Tube Amp Pro is a really interesting setting. Concert Hall just makes it louder and adds reverb, not really for me, but overall the sound quality was very impressive on this phone, much better than anticipated, so kudos Samsung, good job there. Bluetooth was average at best. The connection quality is definitely not as stable as the iPhone or even the LG V20. I would put it above the Pixel and HTC 10, a little bit below the OnePlus 3T and the V20. It didn't cut out quite as much while walking around in my pocket as the Pixel, but it definitely was not as reliable as the V20 or the 3T. It does support aptX Bluetooth audio, which I appreciate, but not aptX HD, which allows for 24-bit files over Bluetooth. But right now, the only phones that support that is LG phones, and hardly any headphones actually support that either. So not a deal breaker at all. Wi-Fi quality here is top notch. I can just run a test so you guys can see. About 115 down is the fastest I've ever seen here in the house. And it's not hitting that right now, of course, because I'm filming. I tested it out last night. It did hit 115 very easily. I think it's just because I have a million devices connected right now. Wi-Fi speeds are pretty much on par with the iPhone, so absolutely no complaints there as far as Wi-Fi goes. Cell quality is above average. You know, I'd say the V20 and the Pixel generally were a little bit better when it came to signal strength, but it was never an issue. There's only a few spots where I noticed it wasn't quite holding as strong a signal as those phones. But the call quality is great. The speakerphone is nice and loud, so really no complaints here as far as connectivity goes. Let's talk software. My first Samsung phone was the S3, and that thing was a beast for about 3 months, and then it slowed down to a crawl and the battery took a nosedive. My wife had the S4 a couple years ago, and that had similar issues, but really from that point on, I started realizing how much I dislike what Samsung did with their Android skins. Since then, I haven't touched a Samsung phone. I just sort of hated on them from a distance. So when I got the S8, I was expecting to really give them shit for TouchWiz or Grace UI or whatever the heck they want to call it now. But after using this for about 2 weeks, I don't really have a whole lot to complain about. You know, I think they got a lot of things right, and the stuff that I have issues with are relatively nitpicky, but I'm still really worried about that Samsung bloat problem where everything's just going to grind to a halt in a few months, you know. But for now, it's a really snappy phone. It's faster than the V20, you know, it's close to the 3T in a lot of ways, and I've had no major issues. It's a really fast phone, and to be honest, I'm pretty impressed. Software is going to be tough to cover because there are so many features and options that Samsung gives you here. Depending on who you are, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. For me, it's awesome. For my wife, it's probably going to be a bit overwhelming. She would prefer not to mess with this, and I can see people getting a little frustrated with having almost too many options. But I'm going to try to cover as many features as I can without turning this into a 2-hour video. Let's start off with Bixby. He's got a dedicated button over here on the left side. You click him, and he pops up. This is a perfect example of what frustrates me with Samsung. There's already an app feature that works great. It'll be really hard to compete with. It's called Google Now. But Samsung thinks it would be better to try to replace that with an in-house feature that doesn't work nearly as well as Google Now does. The dedicated button's a neat idea, but the fact that we can't customize it to whatever application we want is really frustrating. I know you can, if you root the phone, put a custom ROM on there, but not everybody wants to do that. And the problem I've had with the button, although it seems to have improved recently, is that when you would click it, sometimes it wouldn't even register. They recently pushed out an update a couple days ago, and the issue seems to have gone away. But previously, you would click the button, half the time nothing would happen. A quarter of the time something would happen, but it would be about 5 or 6 seconds after you pressed it. But I've been messing around with it the last couple days, and it actually is working very well now. Bixby will show you the weather. They can show you frequently visited web pages, today's activity if you've got Samsung Health going, Samsung Themes, which no matter how many times I swipe away will not stop popping up here, and then some news, sports news, and business news. It's not horrible, but there's really nothing special happening here. You know, they claim that it uses smart technology to pay attention to what you use the phone for and give you things that pertain to your interests. But so far, after 2 weeks, I haven't noticed really any of that. One of the features they've tried to push here is a thing called Bixby Vision. You can click it at the top here, this little eyeball. You point the camera at an object or location, you hold the phone steady, and Bixby Vision takes a look. So let's give it a shot with a book. Okay, so you see it scanned the image, and now it gives me an option of text or image. Sorry, let me move that up there for you guys. Text or image here. Let's click text. Now it's deciphering. And now I can extract it or translate. So select the area that contains the text to extract. And you can see it pretty much worked. So I can save that text or I can share it. That can come in handy, I guess, if you're taking a picture of probably a long Word document, or it's actually like a piece of paper. Something that you want to save and turn into text but you don't want to type out. I can see that being useful. Let's go back. Let's go to translate. Let's just do English to Spanish, and then you drag your finger across what you want it to translate. And it's using Google Translate, funnily enough, and it actually works really well there. So let's give it one more shot. And now it's just giving me image. So let's click image. And I don't know what's happening here now. It's trying to search for images very similar to the one that it sees here, but nothing's really popping up. I think it's looking at the faces. But for me, what I would want here is I can scan the cover of the book and it would link me to, you know, Amazon or somewhere where I can buy it online or see reviews for it. That would be helpful, but so far in my testing, it hasn't really worked out that way. Even Amazon's shitty phone that they tried to put out a couple years ago had that feature, and I think that that is one of the benefits to this type of software. Thankfully though, even though Bixby's here, you can still long press on the home button to use the Google Assistant if needed. Now I want to talk about my absolute least favorite part of this phone, the lock screen. First strike, there's no double tap to wake. You know, I can't double tap anywhere to wake it up. You can long press on the home button, and then you'll get in there, but you can't see the home button while the screen is turned off. You kind of just have to feel for it, and you can't double tap that to turn the lock screen on. I personally think it's a little ridiculous that a phone as feature rich as this one does not have a double tap to wake feature when pretty much every other Android phone does nowadays. Strike two for me is how media playback is handled on the lock screen, so I'm just going to play this, turn that down for you guys. No album art, just some text up here, pause and forward backtrack buttons. I don't know why Samsung went out of its way to change how Android handles album art on the lock screen, because it used to be perfect. You know, you play a song, the album would take up the entire screen, it would look really nice, you'd have a little notification down here to play and pause. Now with this, you've just got text. Now I can tap this, and it'll expand, and that looks okay, but I don't want to have to tap it on the lock screen. The whole point on the lock screen is to see what's happening very quickly. Unfortunately for me, these lock screen media controls are really inconsistent. You know, of course now that I'm filming, it's going to work perfectly. But in my experience, these work about 75% of the time, and every once in a while they just will not respond, and I gotta turn the lock screen off and on again. And it's working perfectly now because it knows I'm filming, but you know, trust me, it's not as consistent as it looks right now. Because this is an AMOLED display, it's got an always-on display. When the screen is off, it's going to display pertinent information and notifications. They can do this without really using a whole lot of battery life, because for AMOLED displays, to display the color black, they actually turn the pixel off, so it's not using any picture to display black. The pixel is just not on. The always-on display is pretty neat. It does display some good information, and it's really customizable. If you go here into Wallpapers and Themes, then you've got AODs, always-on displays. And there are a bunch you can download here, editor's choice. Some of these have color though, which to me kind of defeats the purpose of the always on display. You've got top here, you can sort by free or paid. I went through them really quick and nothing really looked like it was worth getting, but I do like the option here. And while you're here, you can also download system themes. This will change up the notification drawer and the quick tiles and system apps. So for example, you can change the color of all these if you change the theme from the store here. Getting back to the always-on display options, there's a couple different clock styles you can choose from here. You can have the edge clock, which I'll show you guys what that looks like. It'll just pop up right here on the edge. You can change the position, you can change the other side, you can actually change the color, only this color though. And then you've got a calendar that you can have pop up. That's actually pretty cool. And your notifications are going to display right below it with these little circles. Another great thing here is that you can change the schedule. So, you know, when I was going to bed when I first got this phone, I realized that this is really bright when it's on, when the lights are off. So I set a custom schedule to turn off about 10 p.m. It's fantastic that you can do that, and I really appreciate that feature. Samsung is also trying to push their facial recognition and iris scanner. These just aren't as robust, secure, or efficient as a fingerprint. The fingerprint scanner is ideal because you don't need to turn the phone screen on in order to unlock the phone. But for both the face recognition and the iris scanner, you know, you first need to turn the screen on, then let the phone register either your face or irises. The face recognition is really fast, but it can also be compromised very easily with photos, apparently. I would recommend just sticking to fingerprints for now. As I'm sure you can tell, this is a rounded display to deal with these curves and the aspect ratio. You know, I'm not crazy about the top part of the phone here because it's pretty severely rounded. Samsung had to make the status bar a lot smaller than typical Android phones to deal with this size. It also means that fewer notifications can actually fit up here on the top. You know, aesthetic-wise, it's not the greatest. And look at how small something like the settings menu is. I mean, that's teeny tiny, so I miss that all the time. The quick tiles, thankfully, are customizable. You just hit these three little guys. You can do button order. And then here's a list of all the quick tiles you guys have access to. As you can see, I only use 6 of these. One of the neat features here, though, is you can actually change the grid. So you can have a 3x3, you can have a 4x3, or a 5x3, depending on if you've got a ton of quick tiles you want, but you don't want to have to swipe through multiple pages. It's really neat that that feature is here as well. You also can have the brightness control show above the notification panel. This means it displays on the first swipe down rather than having to swipe down again for it to actually pop up. You can change this right here, show control on top. You can disable that if you want, and then when we swipe down once, it's just the quick tiles. Swipe down again, you've got the brightness control there. I prefer it on the first swipe down just because that's typically something that you want to change very quickly. Notifications will stack here, and it has the typical Android 7 functionality where I can swipe down on a notification. It gives you more options. In this case, with Newton email, I can delete from there. My only issue here is they've really shrunk the size of this action. You know, on a regular Android device, this is a bit thicker, both the block notifications section and the added feature when you swipe down on a notification. It's really small, and sometimes it can be tough to hit, especially if you're texting a lot. You want to reply from the notification shade. The actual reply button is about this size, but it's very, very teeny tiny, much smaller than any other Android phone right now. I don't really know why they did that. Alright, so I sent myself a text just to show you guys what I'm talking about here. So let's swipe down. Here's the text, and see how tiny that reply button is. I hit reply, and look at how small this line is. Test, test, test. And the send button is also very tiny. Not a huge deal, but it's a change from the standard of stock Android. I'm not quite sure why they did that. Samsung has a couple features that try to take advantage of this curved display. The biggest one, as far as I can tell, is called Edge Panels, which basically lets you swipe over from a location of your choice. And for me, I have some applications set up. And you can see right here is the location I would need to swipe over from in order to access these. Now we can go into Settings, and this is called Edge Panels, and there's a bunch that you can choose from. I have applications selected. I think that's the most useful, and you can manually change which applications you want to show up on your Edge panel. You've also got People Edge, Smart Select, which can basically take a screenshot, Clipboard, Reminders, Device Maintenance. There's a bunch. Sports on here. Now you can also click the download button right here, and this will take you into the Edge Panels store where you can actually buy some other panel options. Google Keep would probably be one of my favorites to use, but I don't necessarily want to pay $1.50 for that. Calculator panel, calendar panel. There's a Spotify one, there's a Pandora one, the list goes on and on. It's actually really neat. I think this is a pretty cool feature. Now, if you want to, there's some settings that are hidden behind these little 3 dots. You can change the position on the right side, on the left side, however you want to do it. You can make it really small, you can make it gigantic, and then you can make it 100% transparent, or no transparency at all. You can also have it vibrate when the Edge panel is tapped. So a lot of features here. Under Edge Screen in the display options, there's also this Edge Lighting. Let's click that. And this, as you can see here, will kind of light up the edge of the screen if you get a notification, and you can tell it when you want to display it. You can manage which applications actually display notifications for this, and you can manually select them. To me, this is kind of neat, and this would really replace the LED notification light. But this really isn't the most practical use of this display, just something flashy they included. Like I mentioned earlier, Samsung gives you so many options on this phone that it can be kind of overwhelming at first. However, they've actually added a really cool feature. You know, if you're in the settings menu, let's just click Connections. There's this little box down here that says, are you looking for something else? This is really neat because I might be looking for something specifically. Let's say I'm looking for the AlwaysOn Display, and I go to Display. It's actually not in the display settings, which is kind of confusing, but if you scroll down here and you're looking for something else, AlwaysOn Display is here. I click that. It takes me to the AlwaysOn Display setting, which is actually under lock screen settings. This is awesome considering how many options there are, and it's really come in handy for me lately. Another feature is you can adjust the vibration intensity for incoming calls, notifications, and feedback, which is fantastic. Under sounds here, they've got this separate app sound. It says you can play sound from one app on a speaker or headphones separate from the rest of the sounds on your device. So for example, if I have a Bluetooth speaker set up and I'm wanting to open up Spotify, I can set it so that Spotify automatically plays on the Bluetooth speaker, and YouTube automatically plays on the phone speaker. If we go under advanced features right here, they've got a thing called Smart Stay, which is pretty nifty. It'll try to keep the screen on while you're looking at it. You can also quick launch the camera by pressing the power key twice. Just show you guys what that looks like. Yep, that worked really well. Smart Capture right here gives you some editing options after you take a screenshot. You can draw on a screenshot, crop it, or share it from there. You can also set it up so a palm swipe will take a screenshot for you, just like pictured here. Smart Alert is actually pretty interesting. It'll vibrate when you pick it up and it'll let you know about missed calls and messages. This is the default Samsung launcher, and just out of the box it's actually gotten rid of the application drawer. And it's set up just like an iPhone where all of your applications are on a home page. You just keep swiping over. This can be changed in settings. You can add an app drawer, but this was just the default setting. It's kind of interesting. On this phone, there's actually a couple things that reminded me of an iPhone. The phone app, and especially the display when you're in a call, looks almost identical to the iPhone layout. It definitely doesn't look like the standard Nougat layout. The status bar at the top when you're on a call actually turns green just like an iPhone does instead of blue like it typically does on Android. It's not a bad thing. It's just kind of interesting to me to see Samsung trying to mimic Apple in some areas. Another example, this is using the stock Samsung launcher. If you swipe up or if you swipe down, just like on an iPhone, you've got the search bar at the top, and then some of your frequently used applications will pop up here. Now if you go under display, thankfully you can swap the recent apps and back button. I know a lot of people are kind of religious about the back button needs to be on the left side. I personally am not crazy about it. I have trouble reaching it over there. It's my most used button, so I like it close to my hand. Here's where you can switch the button layout. You can also change the background color of the navigation bar down here. I've got it set to black, but here's if it's white, gray, and then there's a color wheel to pick from basically any color you want. So if I wanted like an orange, I could do that, and it'll pop up like that in just about every app. As far as the back buttons go, it's just kind of frustrating that Google goes out of their way to make it a software standard, which is, software is very customizable, hardware is pretty much permanent, but they still don't allow you to swap these, swap the order of this, which kind of boggles my mind because the whole point with software is that it's flexible, so I don't really understand that. Another feature I like here is that when a software update comes through from Samsung for the phone, you can actually delay it and choose an installation time that is convenient for you rather than just hitting cancel or interrupt what you're doing and install it right now. And for what it's worth, the Samsung browser that's built in here actually is pretty impressive. It really reminds me of Safari on OS. It's pretty darn smooth. It doesn't jump around a whole lot like Chrome does when ads are loading late, although apparently that's going to be fixed pretty soon. It's really fast, so it's not that bad of a browser. So it's really not that much of an issue that they have this built in by default. Regarding split screen settings, you actually have to turn it on in the settings menu to get it to work. It's off by default, which I thought was kind of strange. So I just want to show you guys how it works. So let's click this, and then let's have the web browser, BR, the one. It works just like Android Nougat does, but if we click in the center here, there's a couple of neat options Samsung's included. This guy just swaps the order. It switches it from bottom to top, swap back. Click it again. This is a pop-out button. So this actually has one of the applications pop out. You can drag it around on the screen anywhere and use that. And then you can actually minimize it. And it stays here like a little icon. You can drag that around. Click again. I see this being really useful for things like passwords, photographs. If you're trying to copy something from another application, I can see that being a really neat feature. So let's just expand that back. And then of course you can just kind of drag here to adjust the size of the split screen. Works pretty well in my opinion. One thing that irritated me at first was how the phone handled default applications. It seemed like there was no way to select a default app on the fly. For Android phones, when you do something and it opens an app for the first time, it usually lets you pick which app to use, and then it has a checkbox to make that the default, but the S8 did not have that checkbox. But then I realized that there's a setting buried way under applications here. If we click the settings menu, you go to default apps, and default app selection. You gotta change this because right now it sets default apps automatically. You cannot change it, just like an iPhone. You change it to this ask before setting default apps. You open up a new application and it'll ask you which one you want to use as default. I feel it's a little disingenuous that they had that on by default. It reminds me a bit of the iPhone. They want you to use the default apps that they prefer rather than give you the choice, which is, yeah, I know they made the phone, but the whole point of Android to me is customizability. So it is hidden here if you guys are having any issues with that. One thing that to me was pretty strange with this aspect ratio is the keyboard size. This is Swift key, and I'm just going to show you, it's the second smallest one. Let's just go to one of the medium ones, and look how big this thing is. You go over, you go to resize. Here's the smallest one, and that's a pretty good size. That's about the average size. And if we go to one of the bigger ones, it's just way too big. It looks kind of goofy to me. So I think it's something with the aspect ratio and SwiftKey not really knowing what to do, because it's so thin but tall, so it kind of freaks out and just expands it upwards would be my guess. And one last complaint, the recent apps feature. If you look at the animation here, see how jumpy that is? So what it does, it actually tries to jump to the next episode. See how it sticks to it like that? It tries to jump to the next application, and I hate that. It's not smooth. If you use any other Android phone, it's just a really smooth animation. It just rolls through everything, but this one's really jerky to me. I do not like, and I've had a lot of trouble getting used to this because it moves so much differently from any other Android phone I've used. Not sure why they made the change there, but to me it makes it a lot more difficult. To round out the software section of this review, let's talk about battery life. It's actually been pretty darn impressive for me. Not quite Google Pixel XL impressive, but I still managed to average about 4.5 to 5 hours of screen on time with this. I know screen on time is not the best gauge because it varies wildly depending on what you're doing. You know, if you're watching YouTube videos, it'll kill the battery faster than just browsing through web articles. But just to give you guys an idea here, it's got me about an hour screen on time. It's at 87%. There's no SIM card in here, so it's not using the network features, but it's pretty darn impressive. Just to compare this, the Pixel XL, I got about 5 hours on average, maybe 5.5 on a good day. The HTC 10 and the LG V20, anywhere from 3.5 to 4 hours, never ever more than that. The OnePlus 3T, I would put it about the same level as this. Both of those can get about 4.5 average. For the S8, I think this can be attributed to the pretty aggressive app power monitor that they've got built in here. It pops up all the time and it says we've closed some apps in the background that we think are using too much power, and it'll just be things like, you know, my email or YouTube Studio. Of course, this doesn't scan for Samsung apps that are guilty of using up a bit too much battery in the background. And that's really what scares me in the long run. You know, battery life is fine right now. After 2 weeks of usage, I'm getting a pretty good screen on time, but is that going to hold up for the next 2 years? Historically, I don't think that's been the case for Samsung, so that's one of the things that worries me about this phone and makes a review pretty difficult, is because Samsung phones out of the box are generally really impressive. The issues are 6 months, a year and a half down the road, where everything just kind of comes to a grinding halt. To sum things up here, the more I use this phone, the more I actually wanted to go back to something like the Pixel or the 3T or the V20, but my issue was articulating why. I just didn't really like using this phone. I would attribute it to the curved display, the overall software aesthetic, but the more I wrote about it before doing this review, the more I realized that this phone is actually really impressive, and that most likely for 9 out of 10 people, they're going to love it. So I don't want this to come across as some scathing review. I tried to be fair in pointing out all the features and irritations. It definitely has more impressive features than things that irritated me, and it is a really, really solid phone. This thing is gorgeous. It's got the best hardware I've seen in a long time, maybe ever. It's got all the required features to be a true flagship for me. Amazing camera, great battery life, it's fast, it's stable, it has an SD card slot, it's got water resistance. I mean, there's really not a lot that this phone doesn't have. You know, there's only a couple things that worry me about this phone, and one of them is just Samsung's reputation for software. They don't have a track record that proves that they can make a phone that stays consistent, stays fast, doesn't develop any software issues 6 months, a year and a half down the road. I'm pretty curious to see how the S8 does, because I know that the skin is a lot different from some of the previous ones, and allegedly they're making their software more efficient, but this skin to me is still really, really heavy. They made a ton of changes, and that does worry me. If it doesn't get bogged down, I'm all for it. But historically that hasn't been the case, and the few articles I've read, you know, XDA just did one that I can link down below. They talk about all the background processes that they see that Samsung has included that are problematic and will slow the phone down and drain your battery. If this phone can last 2 years, it's one of the best on the market right now. But I am concerned that it's going to have trouble getting there without slowing down or the battery life tanking. To me, something like the Pixel is a safer bet. And you know, in my opinion, the only thing the S8 has that the Pixel doesn't really is water resistance. It's got the curved display, and it has some random features that may or may not be useful depending on who you are and how you use the phone. Obviously, it also has a difference as far as bezels go, and just from an aesthetic standpoint, this phone is much more impressive than the Pixel. But I don't want any of this to come off as trying to take away from what Samsung has done here. This is really, I mean, it's an engineering marvel. It's a really, really impressive piece of hardware. Personally, I'm very, very excited to see what they can cook up with the S9.